Hello there, and welcome back to our Orlando time-lapse series. In today's episode we will finally return to our beloved railroad station and focusing after all this time about the interior of it. Up until this point you only saw me in every episode so far building on another building and on the exterior of it. So in this regard it will be completely different like normally, since we caring for the first time about an interior space. So with this little introduction out of the way, let's dive straight into it, what we are constructing here. The first 2 minutes of this recording is from mid of June, and it's only like this little part where I rework this railing on the staircase. Now when I first created this railing, I completely missed that the actual orientation is vertically. It will of course look way better than before, and it's not only here on this middle staircase, but also on those staircases that are curved on the left and right of this station. At the time of this recording, I skipped the interior of the railroad station, not only because I wanted to have the surroundings of the main hub done in the first place, but also because at this time we still didn't had invisible paths in this game, and that's of course a huge thing that will now come into play when we creating this basement floor of the railroad station. As you can see it here in the recording, the thickness of this ceiling floor is almost 1 meter, and that's due to the thickness of the path foundation. And now since you can have paths without any foundation at all, we are able to make now this ceiling much thinner than it also actually is in reality. In the recording, that's exactly what I'm doing right now. I'm making the ceiling much thinner and also making sure whenever you have people now going up those staircases that they don't plop their head against the ceiling of it. But the crucial thing that I at the time did not really realize, whatever thickness we now set for the ceiling, it defines later on the whole space below it. Sometimes when you are working on something like this here, you aren't completely aware of all of that and you just keep working on it. You don't really think too much about it. I mean, this whole process, when you creating something like this here, it's a very natural process. It's not like I have a plan already at the start of it and I just go through everything. It's much more of a rough picture, and whenever I create something, it kinda sets already the direction in what to create next. Now when you have watched this entire time-lapse series so far, you know that I came up with that a couple of times now, and where you kinda get the impression that you as the creator of it, you are not really in charge, but rather that the park itself makes this decision for you. Now I say this of course not with 100% dead seriousness, but at least sometimes it really feels like it would be the case. But what is certain, whenever I create now all those little tiny things that make at the end the whole picture, they require each of them to be there in the first place. That means whenever I create now, for example, the ceiling of this interior, it kinda requires that I already defined all of those little things around it, like the columns and the walls and all of that. And also those required that I layouted the station in the first place. So whenever you see me create now something right here, there was always something in before that I created. And it naturally led me to the decision making, oh, it might be a good idea to do this thing after it. So at the very end of our little first topic here, I can't ultimately say if it's now only a made-up impression of me, or if there is a deeper underlying logic in place that I unknowingly and maybe also unintentionally follow in a way. So regardless of what it is in the end, one thing that we can be pretty certain here is that it just works out in our favor. And if this continues to do so in the future, we don't have to bother about it. We don't have to solve now every riddle about its creation we just enjoy what we have here. So at this stage we switch over now to our build. We made it now in the footage to the point where we start now our first interior space of this basement floor. You saw me rearrange there a little bit of the layouting of this tunnel, and that's just because the formation of how those columns are arranged there define also where the entrance points are of this basement floor. When we take a deeper look on this basement floor, how it's arranged, you will see that the stroller service is a core part of it. And the consequence out of that is that one side is only accessible by staff members, where those strollers are storaged in a way. Now, in my opinion, the one thing that makes this railroad station so stand out, it's not only the architecture and the whole aesthetic of it, but it's also the fact that it's symmetrical. That's the thing that makes it strong in its design language. So at least to me, it doesn't really make any sense at all to shift away from that only to put this secondary service into it. I mean, don't get me wrong, I find this service very useful, especially for people that have to care about their children, but I'm very certain that there would be other places in the near vicinity that work even better for that. Right here it feels too squeezed into it. It almost makes the impression to me it has to work, but it was not initially designed like that. And this point comes even more stronger if you think about every guest that has now to enter this park. Just imagine, they have to enter this park through those two tunnels here. And only in one of them you have here two options how you enter this park, either through the railroad station or directly through the tunnel. So I would think that 4 options are way better than only 3 options. And to end this little topic, just imagine it's the railroad station. It's maybe the most important building in this whole park aside from the castle. Why would you, in very literal words, handicap yourself on the most important location of your park at the very entrance of it, where most people will be? And that's of course a big topic for any theme park out there. Crowd management. We had this a couple of times until now, where we mostly talked about how they influence now the behavior of guests, how they decide where they go next in the park. So either by achieving that through sightlines or certain weenies, or just by having their cross points where you can choose to go either to this or that direction. But the other core part of this topic is the safety aspect. Whenever and wherever you are in this park, you have to assure that you at all times be safe and that you have the escaping routes that take you to safety. So especially in architecture or pretty much wherever you have an interior space happening, this becomes even more important to have there multiple routes where to go. So for example, if you have there a fire happening or any other incident that blocks now this one route to go, then you are kinda screwed, right? So especially in skyscrapers, for example, you can see this very prominently because you have of course the issue at a very high elevation that you don't have there any natural entry and exit points. So in those instances, you have to totally rely on elevators and multiple staircases to make that place safe and working. Right here in the park we have the luxury, let's say, to have so much exterior space around those buildings. So the likelihood of something happening like a mass panic is pretty low, I would say. And I'm very certain that you would also have there some countermeasurements in place that would go into action then. For us here in the park, we don't have anything like that in the game. But you could of course make now the argument that this game, since it's a simulation game and you have here some semi-realistic crowd behavior, that you could kinda simulate how people would now enter this park or how they would choose in going somewhere. I mean, this is heavily related to the programming of the game itself, But at least to some extent, you have this impression that the park simulates the behavior of your guests where they will go in the end. Having said that, you can't of course compare it to any real-life animation program that would simulate where people would go in a case of emergency. And that's also not what we really want to showcase here in our park. It's just a thing when we create now those buildings and all those structures, we kinda figure out when creating them why the designers of it made it now in this variation, or why they did something in a specific way. And since we see it here in 3D space, we can kinda understand it then much better and maybe also apply it to our own creations whenever you are creating a park on your own. But at this stage, let's return to our build here. You could see me for several minutes now creating this first section here in the basement. Later, this will be the place where you have your queue for this trolley renting service. And the part that makes this area a little bit more special is the ceiling on it. In reality, the ceiling is very ornamented and you have like those cascades that give this much more depthness. And so to create something now like this in Planet Coaster, I would say it's another one of those tricky ones. Not only it has parts where it's not perfectly symmetrical, but you also have to care now about the right curvature, since you have this rounded ceiling. So for me the solution was a little bit fiddly. I used there like a roundish silhouette of those billboards just as a little guidance, and then I tried my best to put those arch shapes in that round formation. And since those arch shapes weren't enough for me, I selected them, each of it, and placed there another little support column in the center of it. So I hope it kinda imitates a little bit of that cascade effect. It's not super perfect, but I think we can get away here pretty effectively. Theoretically, you could of course go now super detailed and invest over 20 hours into that, but since it's pretty secondary or even tertiary, we just leave it like it is, and I think it works for that purpose. But I have to say that I'm very pleased how it looks, and especially later on you will see it in the interior of the railroad station effectively, that having there a ceiling benefits those interiors so tremendously. And I think it comes mainly due to the guest perspective when you are later in this camera mode. Whenever you are standing in one of those interiors, the ceiling but also the flooring will take 60 to 70% of the screenage in front of you. And that's of course a thing when you have a super cool, realistically built railroad station here, but the floor looks like absolute crap, then the whole point of recreating it so realistically is in a way gone. That's the thing I take away with here. When the ceiling and also the flooring looks great, then already half of it is done. So one thing that you see me now doing in a second is to refigure or repositioning the railroad station a little bit to have their finer control over where the entrance and exit is. And also I want to make sure now for the first time that the railroad station is actually also operatable later on. Up until this point, I'm still not sure or simply don't know if people will actually ride the railroad as they should. I trapped myself in this thought, okay, I invest so much time in actually making it so realistically recreated, but I never tested the darn thing, right? So that's the thing I'm trying to do right now. I gone to a completely different park and just placed there very cheaply a railroad and trying to figure out what conditions have to be met in order to make this thing functionable. And the first thing that I noticed here is that it's quite, let's say, tricky to come up with a functional railroad when you first start a park here. You have to actually give people enough reason to ride it. That's the whole point about this test here. I placed on the other side of the station a coaster, and it's the only way how they get there. So the valuable thing I took away with here was the information or the knowledge that I needed to build something in my park as well that would attract their interest in riding now my railroad. So after figuring out this quite useful information, the one thing I had to do prior was to make sure that every path that I have now on this railroad station is also working in the end. And there we are at the point where all those taggy videos come in use for. Now, since we have so much freedom in creating all those paths in the exact way like we want, I was able to manage now those paths. And quite frankly, it took me quite a while to figuring out it completely and to really understand what's going on here. But at some point I understood how this whole system works. So for anybody out there that might be still interested into the workflow of that particular creation of those paths, I will speed down now the footage here and explain you properly what is going on. So in this example, the first thing that you have to make sure here is to place down a part of the path. You can do that either by just creating one segment of it or by just using the stamp mode, which I prefer. And then you can use that same stamp mode also to remove their parts of this path. This will allow you to make now this path in much more complex geometries. Or as I have it here in this example, to have their square paths that are 2 by 2 meters. So once I have created my path, I will multi-select now this path in order to move it. Here in this example, I placed those 2 by 2 meter square paths exactly on those places where you have a flat surface. And then comes the really tricky part here. I go to the draw tool and draw in like a rectangular shape. After that's created, I switch over to the edit tool where you can manipulate each of those little polygons that make up now this shape. And the last part is to wiggle there a little bit on the end section of it so that it snaps to the square path that lies below it. In that fashion you get a ramp-like structure here, and where in my case you can even make multiple ramps where you have like a descending order to it. But this kinda wraps up very shortly the whole process behind it. With this method I created literally every path that is around this railroad station. Not only the staircase in the middle, but also those staircases on the right and left of it. When it comes down to staircases, and you will see it also later in this footage, is you have to be aware that you can't create very sharp angles on it. So a staircase that goes up very rapidly is almost impossible. There is a natural cap on how sharp those staircases can be. And so especially later on when I'm modeling in this middle staircase, there's a, let's say, hidden tolerance I built within it, because the staircase in reality is a bit more sharper than you can make it now in this game. So where you see me now placing down this ramp here, and in short also the mirrored variation on the other side of it, I was afraid and concerned that those pre-built paths that I built on the edge of the map, that they might destroy or break down the path system of this park. I didn't want to corrupt my save game here, so I did multiple copies of it while doing this step. The worst nightmare I could imagine would be to load up this park the next day and suddenly realize something is off with those paths. So aside from that, I constantly gone through now all of those paths that they are still in work and that they did not break anything. So as I'm talking to you right now in this recording, today is the 17th of October and quite a lot of time has passed, but I can assure you that everything in this park right now, and I'm a lot far than you now in this time lapse, everything works as expected. And I did not had any error message or not even any crash, which is quite amazing. When I think back to Planet Coaster 1, crashes were on a daily routine. So in this regard of the safety of our save game, I'm very confident. And maybe since we are just now on this topic here, on the safety of this whole park, I recently bought also another hard drive to have a lot more storage in place to back up all this stuff. Not in particular now the save game, I mean those are only some megabytes, but mainly the footage and recording and all of this video editing. It takes up quite some resources, and I really want also to have a backup of all of this. I mean, you know the story I went through back in the day. I certainly don't want to have this a second time happening. So to come back now to our build, I'm just in the middle of cleaning up a little bit of the pathing of this railroad station. Therefore, I moved the entire visual surface that you see later on of this elevated terrace to the side to have here a better clue of what is happening below it. And just ensuring wherever we have path now in this game happening, that we have it intentionally happening. So regarding to this point, maybe a little bit far-stretched, but who cares? I once told you about Hamburg here in Germany, and mainly told you about it because of the Elbphilharmonie, a very famous concert hall, great architecture. But aside from that, there's a very well-known attraction called Miniatur Wunderland. It's a giant place over multiple floors where they built the world's greatest model railway. And you have there many different themings and different lengths. All in all, it's very impressive. But the thing I mention it here is you have there a very cool magnetic system how they move their vehicles, so cars and so on. And I believe it works by having like a magnetic coil integrated into the roads and streets or wherever those vehicles should drive on. So in that way it kind of reminds me to the path system that we have in this game. Whenever I use paths in this game here, in 99% of the cases I hide those paths underneath something else that serves as the texture of this flooring. And so in that way it kinda performs under the same logic. But besides that, I really recommend to you, if you have the chance to be one day in Hamburg, please visit not only the Elbphilharmonie but also the Miniatur Wunderland. And one final note to that, please make sure to reserve a ticket online because they have limited spaces through the day, so it can be that they don't let you in. I thought it would be a good idea to tell you this because I experienced this exact situation myself, sadly. So the next thing that I'm creating are the paths for those two staircases on the right and left of the station. I used here the same method like I showed you earlier, but the big difference is the shape of it. It's round. So you have to make now this path follow this shape. It's a little bit more tricky and you see that I don't get it perfect. But that's also the thing, it doesn't have to be perfect simply because we make it invisible later on. It only has to be roughly the same shape to tell people, okay, you can walk here. That's one of those things I like so much about this workflow. You only use the gameplay side of those paths, but you actually don't care about how they look because you build that your own. And so in my belief, there's so much more freedom in what you can create then if you don't limit yourself on the visual style of the path itself. And that's only made possible because we now have this tool in the game, that we have the ability to make those paths invisible. Up until where they brought out those features into the game, I were still in the belief that those staircases, they would be forever non-functionable. And so in the end I can't tell you how grateful and thankful I am that all of those things are in the game and that you can realistically create something like that. It will add so much of the immersion later on when you actually have people roaming around those staircases and that they actually can enter now this railroad station. Otherwise, they wouldn't have any idea how to get up there, right? So I'm still working here on this path and I'm trying to make now this curvature that the path goes around this shape as best as possible, because later on I will bring back this terrace, which is also a path, back into this shape. And so those areas where you now have 2 or even 3 different path areas colliding into, you really have to be very intentional and cautious about them, because things can easily break here. And so there's a lot of footage that is currently cut out where I constantly go through and make sure that the path is on all areas there at the exact point where it needs to be, and that the whole thing works out in the end. So at this stage, while I'm still cleaning up here some paths, I'd like to tell you my thoughts and feelings of the current time. I don't know, the last 2 or 3 weeks they feel a little bit weird. There's kinda a lot less happening than usually, both on Frontier but as well on YouTube regarding Planet Coaster. Maybe it has to do something with the weather and the current seasonal time, or it could also be the case that it's very coincidental and just a made-up impression of me. But the one thing that I learned about Frontier, whenever it got quiet around them and you didn't hear so much of updates or news about it, it was for a reason. I strongly believe that currently they're working on something that we will see in the very near future. And so my biggest hope for that would be, of course, that they bring out or bring back the spooky theme. Especially so fittingly before Halloween, because I still think that the importance of this theming, it cannot be replaced just by adding a little bit something similar to that. At this point I won't go into the details why to see it back. I think I made that statement multiple times in those episodes already, but I fear that this might be the last time where we can realistically expect to see something like a spooky pack. After Halloween, I don't see there any reason why they should come back of reintroducing this theming again. In this community, I know of many people that would like to create a much more spooky area in their park. And there are also people, especially on Reddit for example, that made clear that they are only interested into the creation of a spooky park. And so if that would be the case now, it would be devastating news for them. And to be honest, I don't blame them. I can very well understand them. If I would have the same set of interest, I would probably stop playing this game and abandon it. And that's just the fear that I have. I mean, on top of having a lack of players in this game, we shouldn't continue on this trend here. Especially if it's so fixable by just re-importing all those assets from the prequel. If I would like to create a spookish area or ride in this park, I should be able to create it very easily. At the end, it shouldn't rely on my own creative possibilities and abilities of creating maybe something very similar looking to a spookish theme, but rather instead to have there now a spookish theme that does this job for us in a way. So that wraps up my little opinion about this topic. Maybe you have a completely different opinion. I could also imagine that there are a lot of people that just don't care about it too much. But at least to me it's about so much more, because I fear that this is the beginning, that we also see all those other packs from back then getting replaced in some way. But having said all of those things now, we might come back now to our build here. And you could kinda say that this is maybe a critical point in our journey here. It's the first time where we let people in the park. The main reason for it being to test out now all the stuff that we built in this episode. All those different pathings on the railroad station, we still don't know if they work as they are intended. And so I open here those park gates for the first time. You can see those people roaming to the entrance. And I was a little bit shocked to see that some of them turned around and didn't bother to get into the park. Now I may suspect that this is kind of the system how this works. The people go first to this gate and then they are basically free to go wherever they like. Or in other words, they just don't know where the park boundaries are. In that regard, I'm very excited or interested in other creators, for example Aston Wolf, how he dealt with this thing. I mean, there you have Wilderness Springs, where you have on one side a resort and on the other side the actual theme park. And in the middle you have this giant public space with the road that is kinda outside of the park boundaries in a way. But still I'm assuming that people, wherever they are now in this park or in this map, they at all times feel like they are inside this park. Once they have paid for their ticket at the park gate, they are free to go wherever they like. And that's kind of the thing. I mean, it depends also where you put now the spawner and the park gate. Depending on that, you can directly influence where people will go in the first place. And to get back now to our park here, it would make sense to put that thing, of course, in places that make sense to the park in reality. I mean, on places like the ferry boat or on the monorail station. But we might get back now to our build here. I kinda drift apart again. The thing that I'm just creating here is our first loop for our railroad, and so that we also have another station here where you can ride this railroad. We want to give our guests now a reason to ride it. It's the thing that I talked earlier about. And so here I'm creating just a very generic coaster so that they enter our railroad station. So when you see this now, it's really quickly built and doesn't really look any good. But it's also really not relevant here. We just want to test it out and figure out how guests now move in our park. Later on I will also create there like a little street to this place in order to see if they now choose the road over the railroad itself. So after testing those things a little bit out, I can tell you ultimately what option they now prefer. It looked very random to me. In theory, they should use the option whichever is more quicker to get there. So if there's something very close to them, they should go there on foot. And when it is on the other side of the map, then they should use, of course, our railroad. But we will figure that out at some point, I'm pretty sure. But back to our park now. You can see all those people roaming around here on the station, and they're using all of those staircases and those ramps as well. Right here on the entrance of the railroad station, you can see that they are kinda lining up here for the queue. I left out the queue intentionally here, so it's only like connected to a path. But still, as you can see it, they figure out a queue on themselves. And I have to say that it's quite impressive as a gameplay mechanic, that they do that on their very own. The only drawback right now is that they collide through those walls and those door frames. That's the thing that we care about in the next episode, where we will make like little path stamps to tell people, okay, in those areas you can't really stand and walk. So when you compare this now in reality, it's two different things. In reality, people are kinda queuing up or standing on the station platform itself. In our case here in the game, it's not possible in that way. It's mainly due to the big size of the station platform itself, how it's handled in the game, and you don't have there any more space for the added queue on the side of it. And that's why I think you get away the best here if you just say, okay, you have now this queue inside the main hall, and people are waiting there until the train arrives. Now there are of course some things that you might see here when they enter now this railroad, where they kinda collide with the fencing that I made here. I mean, when I think of it, you probably could make there some pistons that would trigger and move now parts of those fences to the side so that you have like little openings where people can pass through. But regarding the point where we are in the park, I think it's very safe to say that's super secondary right now. So as our train departs now from our station here, I would like to conclude today's episode. There were again a lot of interesting things today, and the next couple of episodes will all circle around the railroad station and its interior. So with having said that, if you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, like or comment, become a member on this channel to gain pre-access to the park, join our Discord server, watch my other videos about Anaheim or Orlando, and thank you for watching. See you in the next one. Bye.